At 3:30 on the afternoon of October 23, 1942, Captain Ernst Bauer of the Afrika Korps sat in a British interrogation tent outside Alamein, with his hands still trembling from shell fire. The British intelligence officer across the wooden table was patient, methodical, asking standard questions about unit strength and defensive positions. Bauer answered some, deflected others, maintained the minimal cooperation expected of a captured officer. Then he leaned forward and asked his own question. Your automatic 25-pounders, where are the loading mechanisms housed? We've been trying to work it out for months. The British officer looked up from his notepad. I'm sorry. Bauer gestured with his bound hands. The automatic guns, the ones that fire without stopping. Some kind of belt feed system, yes? Or rotating magazines? The British officer set down his pen slowly. Corporal, they're loaded by hand. Every single round. Bauer's face hardened. That's impossible. We counted 17 shells in 60 seconds from a single gun position. No crew can maintain that rate manually. It violates physics. The intelligence officer smiled slightly. Nevertheless, Hauptmann, every shell is loaded, aimed, and fired by a 6-man crew. No automation. No secret mechanism. Just training. Bauer sat back, clearly unconvinced. This conversation would repeat itself dozens of times over following weeks as more German and Italian prisoners cycled through British interrogation centers. The same question, the same disbelief, the same stubborn insistence that the British must be using some revolutionary automatic artillery piece that fired faster than human hands could manage. Some prisoners demanded to see the weapons personally. Others accused the British of deliberately concealing military secrets in violation of Geneva Conventions. A few simply refused to believe it, maintaining until the end that British propaganda was covering up technical superiority to preserve some tactical advantage. The truth was simultaneously simpler and more impressive than any mechanical innovation. The British Commonwealth forces in North Africa had no automatic artillery. What they possessed was something far more dangerous. Exceptional crews operating a superbly designed weapon within a revolutionary fire control system that could mass hundreds of guns on a single target in minutes. The Ordnance QF 25-pounder wasn't just a field gun. It was the centerpiece of an artillery doctrine that German commanders would come to fear more than British tanks, more than the Desert Air Force, more than any other weapon system in the entire North African campaign. When General Lieutenant Erwin Rommel arrived in Tripoli on February 12, 1941, to take command of what would become Panzerarmee Africa, he brought considerable advantages. His tank crews were experienced veterans from the French campaign. His combined arms coordination was superior to British doctrine at that stage of the war. The formidable 88mm flak gun served brilliantly in an anti-tank role, destroying British Matildas and Crusaders at ranges where they couldn't effectively return fire. Rommel himself possessed tactical brilliance that would earn him enduring fame, an ability to read battlefields and exploit enemy weaknesses with devastating speed. His rapid advance across Cyrenaica in March and April 1941 demonstrated these advantages conclusively, pushing British forces back to the Egyptian border and isolating Tobruk. But there was one area where Rommel could never achieve parity, let alone superiority. British artillery dominated the desert from the campaign's beginning to its end, and that dominance would prove decisive. The standard German field howitzer in North Africa was a 105mm Luftwaffe-18, a perfectly adequate weapon by European standards. It had served well in Poland and France, providing reliable indirect fire support for Wehrmacht operations. But the Western Desert exposed its limitations ruthlessly. The Luftwaffe-18 split-trail design made traverse slow and cumbersome. Its range of 10,675 meters was adequate but not exceptional. Its rate of fire peaked at about 4 rounds per minute with an experienced crew, dropping to 2 or 3 rounds per minute in sustained bombardment. The weapon was relatively heavy at 1,985 kilograms, making it difficult to maneuver quickly across soft sand. Most critically, its crew drills had been developed for European warfare, where artillery moved infrequently and fired from prepared positions. The Ordnance QF 25-pounder represented a fundamentally different design philosophy. British artillery doctrine in the 1930s recognized that future warfare would demand greater mobility and flexibility. The Royal Artillery needed a weapon that could replace both the 18-pounder field gun and a 4.5-inch howitzer, combining the flat trajectory and range of the former with the plunging fire and explosive power of the latter. The result was a 25-pounder, officially entering service in 1940. Its specifications revealed careful engineering. The weapon fired a 25-pound high-explosive shell to a maximum range of 13,400 meters, nearly 3 kilometers farther than the German 105 millimeters. This range advantage was tactically significant, allowing British batteries to engage German positions while remaining outside counter-battery range. The gun's variable charge system used bag propellant in white silk bags, giving crews precise control over range and trajectory. Charge Super could reach maximum distance, while Charge 1 provided minimum range for close and defensive fire. This flexibility meant a single 25-pounder battery could handle missions that might require multiple German weapons. But the weapon's true brilliance lay in its mounting. The 25-pounder sat on a circular platform that allowed 360-degree traverse. A crew could swing the gun to face any direction in seconds without moving the entire weapon. This capability was revolutionary. German and Italian guns needed their entire trail assemblies repositioned for significant direction changes, a process requiring several minutes and considerable physical effort. British crews simply rotated the gun on its platform, keeping the layer's sight picture continuous. The breech mechanism was equally clever. A simple vertical sliding block opened and closed rapidly, and the weapon's recoil system returned the barrel to battery position automatically, maintaining aim. The layer never lost his sight picture between rounds. He simply adjusted elevation minutely and called ready. The combination of circular platform and efficient breech allowed trained crews to achieve firing rates that German soldiers literally could not believe humans could manage. British and Commonwealth artillery training emphasized speed, precision, and teamwork. A 25-pounder crew consisted of 6 men, each with precisely defined roles. The detachment commander controlled the gun, receiving fire orders and ensuring proper execution. The layer operated the traversing and elevating mechanisms, keeping the sight continuously on target. The breech worker opened and closed the breech mechanism, inserted primers, and fired on command. The loader took rounds from the ammunition numbers and rammed them home. 2 ammunition numbers prepared rounds, selected proper charges, removed projectiles from their containers, and kept the ready rack stocked. These 6 men trained until their movements became automatic, each action flowing into the next without hesitation. The best crews developed an almost mechanical rhythm. Breech open, round in, breech closed, fire. Breech open, round in, breech closed, fire. The layer never moved his eye from the sight. The breech worker's hands flew through their sequence. The loader's ramming stroke was smooth and consistent. The ammunition numbers kept rounds flowing in an unbroken stream. Some elite crews achieved rates of 17 rounds per minute in short bursts, though 8 to 10 rounds per minute was more sustainable. Even this sustainable rate was double what German crews could manage. British training also emphasized rapid deployment and withdrawal. Commonwealth batteries practiced what they called shoot and scoot tactics. Upon receiving a fire mission, the battery would unlimber, come into action, fire the required rounds, and be ready to move again within minutes. This mobility frustrated German counter-battery efforts. By the time German guns ranged in on a British position, the battery had already displaced to a new location several hundred yards away. Forward observation officers with frontline units had direct authority to call fire missions without navigating multiple layers of command approval. This delegation of authority was revolutionary. A junior officer with the advancing infantry could bring down battery, regimental, or even divisional fire simply by radioing coordinates and a target designation. German artillery doctrine required more centralized control, with fire missions approved by battalion or regimental commanders. This cost precious minutes in rapidly developing situations. The British fire control system, however, was the true revolution. Royal Artillery doctrine had developed a target classification system that allowed rapid massing of artillery from dispersed positions. A battery target engaged a single 8-gun battery. A Mike target brought down 3 batteries. 24 guns firing simultaneously. An Uncle target massed 9 batteries, 72 guns, onto a single area. A Victor target, the most devastating, could bring hundreds of guns to bear on a single target area within minutes. The mathematics behind this system were elegant. Rather than directing individual guns at individual targets, British fire control treated artillery as an area weapon. Gun position officers calculated firing data for the center of a target area. Individual guns in the battery made minor adjustments based on their position relative to the GPO. This allowed an entire battery to engage as a single unit, delivering devastating firepower in concentrated salvos. Multiple batteries could coordinate through regimental or divisional fire direction centers. A forward observer calling an Uncle target would specify coordinates and a target description. The divisional artillery commander would allocate batteries, transmit firing data, and within 2 to 3 minutes, 72 shells would impact the target area simultaneously. This concentration of fire had effects beyond simple destruction. The psychological impact of sudden, overwhelming bombardment broke infantry attacks and scattered vehicle formations. German after-action reports repeatedly mention the devastating effect of British artillery concentrations, describing soldiers too stunned to follow orders and attacks disintegrating under shell fire before ever reaching British lines. At 2nd Alamein, the British Commonwealth artillery resources were staggering. General Montgomery concentrated approximately 900 guns along a front of roughly 40 miles. The opening barrage on the night of October 23, 1942 fired over 500,000 shells in the first 24 hours. German defenders later described the bombardment as beyond anything experienced on the Eastern Front, a continuous roar of explosions that destroyed field fortifications, severed communication lines, and killed or wounded thousands of Axis soldiers. The logistics behind this artillery dominance were equally important. British supply lines ran overland from the Suez Canal and by sea to Egyptian ports, relatively secure routes that delivered ammunition in vast quantities. Commonwealth artillery batteries in the desert rarely faced ammunition shortages. Gun crews could fire pre-planned defensive fire missions knowing they had hundreds of rounds per gun available. They could respond to targets of opportunity without worrying about conserving shells. This abundance allowed aggressive, wasteful-seeming fire plans that German commanders envied. Rommel's supply situation was dramatically different. Every shell, every drop of fuel, every replacement vehicle had to cross the Mediterranean under constant attack from the Royal Navy and RAF. British submarines, destroyers, and aircraft hunted Axis convoys relentlessly. In July 1942, 41% of supplies shipped to North Africa were sunk before reaching port. In October, the figure rose to 44%. Those supplies that reached Libya still had to travel hundreds of miles over poor roads under constant air attack. By late 1942, Axis artillery units were rationing ammunition carefully. Batteries that should have had hundreds of rounds per gun were operating with dozens. Counter-battery fire, which required substantial ammunition expenditure, became a luxury Rommel could rarely afford. Bombardments were brief and carefully targeted rather than sustained area fire that British guns delivered routinely. At El Alamein, while British guns were firing 500,000 shells, German batteries were scrounging for enough rounds to support immediate defensive needs. This disparity in available ammunition meant that even when German guns matched British weapons technically, they couldn't match British firepower practically. A German battery with 50 rounds couldn't engage in the sustained harassment fire that British batteries used to disrupt enemy movements. They couldn't respond to every detected target. They had to prioritize ruthlessly, often holding fire even when profitable targets presented themselves. The superiority of the 25-pounder wasn't merely theoretical. In battle after battle across the Western Desert, British artillery proved decisive. During the Siege of Tobruk in 1941, British and Australian gunners used their 25-pounders to break up repeated German and Italian attacks. The concentrated fire of the fortress artillery caught assault forces in the open, inflicting casualties that made continued attacks prohibitively expensive. Rommel wrote in his papers about watching attacks dissolve under British fire, describing entire areas swept clean by shell bursts. During Operation Crusader in November 1941, British XXX Corps advanced with strong artillery support. German intelligence reports captured later noted specifically that British guns outranged German weapons, and that British fire control was superior to Wehrmacht doctrine. The ability to mass fires from dispersed positions impressed German commanders who were accustomed to more rigid, centralized artillery control. At First Alamein in July 1942, British artillery helped stop Rommel's advance toward the Nile Delta. Concentrated fire from Commonwealth guns disrupted German attempts to penetrate British defensive positions, buying time for reinforcements to arrive and stabilize the front. At Alamein at the end of August 1942, Montgomery deliberately funneled Rommel's attack into a defensive position backed by concentrated artillery. British gunners destroyed numerous German tanks and infantry formations, convincing Rommel that breakthrough was impossible without unacceptable losses. The battle demonstrated how well-positioned artillery could stop even the most aggressive armored thrust. But Second El Alamein in October and November 1942 was a definitive demonstration of British artillery superiority. Montgomery's plan deliberately emphasized artillery as the primary killing weapon. The barrage that opened the battle at 2,140 hours on October 23rd was carefully orchestrated. 900 guns opened fire simultaneously, targeting Axis defensive positions along the entire front. Forward batteries engaged frontline positions. Medium batteries hit command posts and supply dumps. Counter-battery fire targeted German and Italian gun positions. The bombardment continued for 5.5 hours before infantry advanced. German soldiers who survived described the experience as indescribable. Continuous explosions, blast waves that knocked men unconscious, shrapnel that shredded anyone above ground. Communication trenches collapsed. Field fortifications disintegrated. Radio aerials were blown away, severing contact between units. Medical stations were overwhelmed immediately. Many soldiers suffered burst eardrums from a concussion. Some went temporarily mad, wandering in shock until captured. German artillery could not respond effectively. Ration ammunition meant batteries fired sparingly, tried conserved shells for the infantry battle they knew would follow the bombardment. British counter-battery fire targeted German guns aggressively, destroying many before they could fire more than a few rounds. The psychological effect was as important as the physical destruction. German and Italian infantrymen who endured the barrage were badly shaken before British infantry ever reached their positions. Morale collapsed in many units. Surrender rates during the subsequent infantry assault were far higher than in previous desert battles, partly because defenders had been battered beyond the capacity for effective resistance. Over 12 days of fighting, Commonwealth artillery fired approximately 3 million shells. This expenditure would have been impossible without secure supply lines and vast ammunition stockpiles. German guns fired a tiny fraction of that number, limited by ammunition shortages that grew worse as the battle progressed. By the time Rommel ordered withdrawal on November 4th, his artillery was nearly silent, unable to provide covering fire for retreating infantry and armor. The Afrika Korps left behind hundreds of disabled vehicles and thousands of prisoners, partly because artillery could not suppress British pursuit forces. The battle demonstrated conclusively that material superiority, when properly employed, could overwhelm tactical brilliance. Rommel's operational skill couldn't compensate for British firepower. The ultimate validation of the 25-pounder superiority came from an unlikely source: the Germans themselves. As the Desert Campaign progressed, Axis forces captured approximately 50 British 25-pounder guns, mostly during Rommel's successful offensives in 1941 and early 1942. Rather than destroying these weapons, German artillery commanders enthusiastically pressed them into service. The guns were officially designated 8.76 centimeters FK-280E, the E denoting English origin. German ordnance departments manufactured ammunition compatible with the captured weapons. Artillery batteries in the Afrika Korps integrated the 25-pounders into their gun lines, and German gunners quickly came to appreciate their advantages. Captured documents and prisoner interrogations revealed German assessments of the weapon. Reports praised the 25-pounder's lighter weight compared to the Luft-18. making it easier to move across sand. The circular platform's 360-degree traverse was repeatedly mentioned as superior to German split-trail designs. The higher rate of fire impressed German crews who struggled to match British firing speeds with their own weapons. The longer range allowed captured 25-pounders to engage targets beyond the reach of standard German howitzers. At the height of German use of captured artillery in mid-1942, approximately 10% of all German field artillery pieces in North Africa were British 25-pounders. This percentage would have been higher if more weapons had been captured. The Germans were so impressed they requested their ordnance designers develop similar features for future artillery pieces. When your enemy adopts your weapons enthusiastically and wishes he had more of them, the superiority of your design is beyond question. Italian forces similarly valued captured 25-pounders, integrating them into artillery groups with even less modification than the Germans required. Commonwealth crews who recaptured previously lost guns sometimes found them well-maintained and still in service, testament to their reliability and effectiveness. The mobility of British 25-pounder batteries was another source of German frustration. Commonwealth artillery doctrine emphasized rapid deployment and frequent displacement. British batteries were fully motorized, typically towed by Morris or Bedford trucks in North Africa, later by Canadian military pattern vehicles and American Lend-Lease trucks. A battery receiving orders to move could limber guns, load ammunition, and be ready to roll in under 10 minutes with a well-trained crew. Upon reaching new position, the battery could unlimber, come into action, and fire within 5 minutes. This meant a battery could move from one position to another, a distance of several miles, and be ready to engage targets again in 15 to 20 minutes. German batteries using horse-drawn transport or slower vehicles took substantially longer. British shoot-and-scoot tactics exploited this mobility advantage ruthlessly. A battery would fire several salvos at a target, attracting German counter-battery fire. Before enemy shells arrived, the British guns were already limbered and moving. German counter-battery rounds would fall on empty positions. By the time German forward observers corrected and ranged in again, the British battery was at a new location, ready to resume firing. This mobility also allowed British artillery to keep pace with advancing armor formations during exploitation phases. Batteries would leapfrog forward, one firing while another moved, maintaining continuous artillery support for advancing troops. German guns, slower and more cumbersome, often lagged behind their supported units, creating gaps in fire support that British forces exploited. The 25-pounder's relatively light weight for its caliber contributed to this mobility. At approximately 1,800 kilograms in action, it was lighter than the German 105mm Luftwaffe-18, while delivering comparable explosive effect and superior range. This weight advantage meant British guns could traverse soft sand more easily, required smaller towing vehicles, and could sometimes be manhandled by crew alone over short distances. While designed primarily as an indirect fire weapon, the 25-pounder occasionally served in a direct-fire anti-tank role when circumstances demanded. The circular platform that made indirect fire so rapid also allowed quick engagement of unexpected armored threats. British gunners at Tobruk, Knightsbridge, and various desert actions engaged German tanks at ranges under 1,000 yards using high-explosive shells and, occasionally, armor-piercing shot. The 25-pounder could penetrate the side armor of Panzer III and early Panzer IV tanks at close range, though it was far less effective than dedicated anti-tank guns like the 6-pounder or 17-pounder. The weapon's value in this role was primarily defensive, allowing artillery batteries to defend themselves when overrun by armored attacks rather than serving as a primary anti-tank asset. The 360-degree traverse proved invaluable during these engagements. A tank approaching from an unexpected direction could be engaged immediately without repositioning the gun. German accounts mention the shock of advancing against what they assumed were undefended artillery positions only to receive direct fire from multiple guns simultaneously. Several German tank commanders reported being engaged by 25-pounders in direct fire and withdrawing rather than pressing attacks to the defensive fire. The psychological effect of any artillery firing directly at approaching tanks was significant, even when the guns weren't optimized for the role. The legacy of the 25-pounder extended far beyond the Western Desert. The weapons served the British Commonwealth through Italy, Northwest Europe, and dozens of other theaters during World War II. After the war, it remained in British service until the early 1960s, seeing action in Korea, Malaya, Suez, and numerous colonial conflicts. Commonwealth nations used the weapon even longer. The Australian Army employed 25-pounders in Vietnam in the 1960s. Several nations kept the weapons in reserve or second-line service into the 1980s. The gun's reliability, maintainability, and effectiveness ensured its longevity. Post-war, many German officers who had faced British artillery wrote memoirs or were interviewed by military historians. A consistent theme emerged. British Commonwealth artillery was the most professional, effective, and feared artillery they encountered during the entire war, including the Eastern Front. German generals noted that Soviet artillery relied on mass guns and overwhelming numbers, compensating for less sophisticated fire control through sheer volume. British artillery, by contrast, demonstrated precision, flexibility, and efficiency that German officers found technically impressive. General Lieutenant Fritz Bayerlein, who served as Rommel's chief of staff in North Africa, wrote post-war that British artillery superiority was a constant problem the Afrika Korps never solved. He noted that Commonwealth gunners were better trained, their equipment was superior, and their fire control procedures were years ahead of German doctrine. Oberst Friedrich von Mellenthin, intelligence officer for Panzerarmee Africa, wrote in his memoirs that British artillery was the dominant weapon in the desert, more decisive than tanks or aircraft. He described the experience of being under British bombardment as terrifying and noted that German soldiers learned to fear the distinctive whistle of incoming 25-pounder shells. The admiration was not theoretical. During prisoner interrogations throughout the campaign, German and Italian soldiers repeatedly expressed shock at British firing rates. The pattern established at El Alamein in October 1942 continued to the end of the African campaign. Captured soldiers asked about automatic loading mechanisms, belt feed systems, or some revolutionary technology that explained impossible firing speeds. The British explanation remained constant. No automation, just training and technique. Some German soldiers saw demonstrations after capture, watching British crews fire live rounds at sustained high rates. These demonstrations often elicited applause or exclamations of disbelief. Many prisoners still assumed the demonstrations were somehow rigged, or that the crews were elite specialists rather than representative of normal British artillery standards. German officers examined captured 25-pounders carefully, trying to understand the mechanical features that enabled such performance. They noted the efficient breech, the circular platform, the well-designed recoil system, but they also recognized that mechanism alone didn't explain the performance gap. The human element, training, coordination, crew efficiency, was as important as engineering. Some German artillerymen later stated this was the hardest lesson. That British success wasn't purely technical, but reflected superior training doctrine and institutional emphasis on artillery excellence. The German army had assumed that artillery doctrine was adequate, developed through decades of experience and proven in multiple campaigns. British performance in the desert demonstrated that assumptions of adequacy were insufficient. By the time German ordnance and training commands recognized the need for doctrinal changes, the war's momentum had shifted permanently against them. The 25-pounder success reflected broader themes in British Commonwealth military culture. The Royal Artillery had institutional pride stretching back centuries, a culture of precision and professionalism that permeated training and operations. Artillery was never merely a support arm in British doctrine, but a primary killing weapon, deserving the best personnel and equipment. This attitude produced investment in training, development of sophisticated fire control procedures, and willingness to innovate tactically. Commonwealth gunners took professional pride in their gunnery, competing informally to achieve the fastest firing rates and most accurate fire. This culture of excellence produced crews who trained harder and performed better than opponents who viewed artillery as a secondary concern. The weapon itself embodied British engineering philosophy. Practical, reliable, effective. It wasn't the most powerful artillery piece of the war, nor the longest range, nor the heaviest. It was, however, superbly suited to its intended role. The design balanced competing requirements intelligently, producing a weapon that performed excellently across a wide range of tasks and conditions. This pragmatic design philosophy served British forces well throughout the war. The 25-pounder never broke down frequently like some more complex weapons. It functioned reliably in desert sand, Italian mud, and northwest European cold. Crews could maintain it with basic tools and minimal specialized training. Ammunition production was straightforward, allowing vast quantities to be manufactured and distributed. These practical considerations mattered as much as ballistic performance in determining the weapon's effectiveness. Captain Ernst Bauer, the German officer who couldn't believe 25-pounders weren't automatic, spent the remainder of the war in a prisoner-of-war camp in Canada. After the war, he returned to Germany and worked as a civilian engineer. In a 1954 letter to a British veteran he'd met during captivity, Bauer wrote about his interrogation in 1942. He admitted he had remained convinced for months after capture that the British were lying about their guns being manually loaded. Only after seeing demonstrations and speaking with multiple British gunners did he accept the truth. He wrote that this realization was humbling, forcing him to acknowledge that German technical confidence had been misplaced. He noted that the Afrika Korps had gone into the desert assuming German equipment and training were superior. British artillery shattered that assumption comprehensively. His letter concluded with a reflection that many German veterans shared. That respect for British professionalism had grown considerably during captivity and in the post-war years, as former enemies compared experiences honestly. The greatest compliment one soldier can pay another is acknowledging their superiority in their craft. German insistence that British guns must be automatic was, in its way, the highest tribute German soldiers could offer. They were saying, in effect, that British Commonwealth gunners performed at a level beyond what Germans believed humans could achieve manually. This assumption of technological advantage was preferable psychologically to accepting that enemy soldiers were simply better trained and more skilled. The truth was simpler and more impressive than secret technology. 6 men, working in perfect coordination, armed with a well-designed weapon and backed by a sophisticated fire control system, could achieve results that appeared superhuman to opponents who lacked those advantages. British and Commonwealth artillery crews in North Africa were not superhuman. They were simply very, very good at their jobs, supported by doctrine and equipment that allowed their skill to translate into devastating battlefield effectiveness. That combination of human excellence and technical design produced a weapon Rommel called the desert's real terror, the system German prisoners couldn't believe was possible, and the artillery force that dominated the North African battlefield from beginning to end.